Thank you all for coming. Thank you for our panelists. Thank you for Professor O'Malley. And thank you for helping us with this panel discussion. I'd also like to thank the MGS Dean's Office and the CLA Dean's Office support staff. Gifty, Deborah Jackson is our assistant here. She's setting up everything. Thank you, Gifty. And we have also Elena Sumaku, who is the Dean's assistant here in the CLA Dean's Office. Thank you to you as well, Elena. Okay, welcome. Welcome to this. It's becoming now an annual event of the Moakley Chair. This is an online webinar that we run every year. The title for today's webinar is New World Disorder. My name is Adunya Lami. I'm the director of the McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Very privileged to have prominent speakers today, together with Professor O'Malley. I have the privilege of introducing our guests. But before that, I would like to say a few words about the Moakley Chair, which is part of the McCormack Graduate School here at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. The Moakley Chair was established in 2006 to honor the memory of the late Congressman John Joseph Moakley, who represented South Boston in Congress from 1973 until his death in 2001. One of his roles for John Moakley as President Ronald Reagan's envoy to El Salvador, Congressman Moakley uncovered the Salvadorian military's role in the murder of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and her daughter in 1989. As a result, Congress cut off aid to El Salvador, forcing the military in the brutal civil war there to come to the negotiating table and bring the brutal civil war to an end. One of the founding professors heading the Moakley Chair is Professor Porego O'Malley. Professor O'Malley is a close confidant of John Moakley. He is the current Moakley Chair. He is a distinguished professor for peace and reconciliation since it was inaugurated in 2006. And he's a founding editor of the New England Journal of Public Policy. For 50 years, his scholarly activism has focused on helping resolve conflicts in divided societies in places such as Northern Ireland, South Africa, Iraq, and the Middle East. He is the author of numerous books, including his The Two-State Delusion, Israel and Palestine, A Tale of Two Narratives, which foretold many of the events that's unfolding today in the Middle East. His most recent book, for which he and Lord Adderley was co-editors, The Changing Character of War and Peacemaking, was published in September 2024. Thank you, Professor O'Malley, for your dedication, for your service, over 50 years of service to making peace to places where we need your support the most. Thanks so much. Now, it's also my privilege to introduce our 2 distinguished guests to speak to us from different parts of the world. And I'm sure some of the time there is early evening. So I'm very happy that you can join us, especially Professor Ramakrishnan. Probably it's midnight now, but thank you so much for coming. And Professor Adderley also is from Paris now, which the time is getting a little bit late. So thank you. So let me say a few words about our 2 panelists today. Professor Lord John Adderley, a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, trained in medicine, psychiatry, and psychoanalysis, and applied his skills in teaching and clinical work as a center for psychotherapy that he established in Belfast. But also, he took this understanding of his medicine and psychology into politics to address the long-standing political violence in Northern Ireland. He works on conflict issues with various academic positions at the University of Oxford and is also a professor of practice both at the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Peace, Security and Justice at Queen's University, Belfast, and as the Global Humanity for Peace Institute of the University of Wales, Trinity, St. David. Professor Lord Adlis is the founding chairman of the Concord Foundation. He is a member of the House of Lords Select Committee on International Relations, and he is also executive chairperson of the Changing Character of War Centers at Pembroke College, University of Oxford and UK, and is also a UK trade envoy to several countries in Central Asia. It's my privilege to thank you, Professor Adlis, for coming and for joining us this late hour from where you are. I appreciate your presence. Thanks so much, sir.
You're welcome.
Our next guest, as I said earlier, is our next panelist is Professor Kumar Ramakrishna. He is a professor of National Security Studies. He is a Provost Chair in National Security Studies, Dean of the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, as well as research advisor to the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at the Rajaratnam School. Prior to his current appointment, he was head of the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research. He was head of the Center of Excellence for National Security. He was head of the National Security Studies Program, and he is also Associate Dean for Policy Studies at the same school. Thank you very much again. I know I mentioned a little bit earlier about your time difference here, and I very much appreciate your presence. And thank you to you both for coming, and I'm sure that the audience will learn and enjoy your presentation and your discussion on this important topic. It gives me a pleasure now to invite Professor O'Malley to get us started. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Adugna, and thank you, John and Kumar. You are both very busy people at opposite ends of the earth, and I really appreciate your taking part in this webinar. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1991 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Francis Fukuyama, one of the preeminent political scientists of this time, wrote The End of History and the Last Man. He argued that the evolution of humanity had reached an end point, with the final form of government, the Western liberal democracy order, anchored in the post-World War II institutions, including the United Nations, NATO, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A rule-based order was in place and in the process of being universally accepted. The US was the uncontested top dog in a unipolar world. History, of course, has had the last laugh. Today, multiple indicators suggest this post-World War II order is unraveling, that it is no longer fit for purpose. Amnesty International 2024 report states that, quote, the international global system is on the verge of collapse. It accused China, Russia, and the United States of leading in total disregard for the rules and values enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Trump administration's return to power in 2024 has accelerated this decline. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio declared that the post-World War II global order is, quote, not just obsolete, it is now a weapon being used against us. Under Trump's leadership, the United States has withdrawn from key agreements, including the Climate Peace Accord and World Health Organization, has undermined the World Trade Organization's foundational purpose by a chaotic imposition of tariffs that has upended global trade, has unleashed a trade war between China and the US, and might yet unleash a retaliatory global trade war threatening a global economic recession. But the collapse did not begin with the Trump presidency. Critics argue that the rules-based international order reflects a Western-centric worldview, privileging the interests of a small group of powerful countries, particularly the United States and its allies. Russia, China, and the global South have denounced it as a tool for perpetuating Western dominance under the guise of international and universal rules. The world now is multipolar, not unipolar. Liberal democracies have been under siege, and the UN is functional and sclerotic for years. Globalization has redefined what state sovereignty means. Democracy has declined, our electoral autocracies are ongoing in 42 countries in 1923, accounting for 35% of the world's population. Democratization, on the other hand, was ongoing in 28 countries, accounting for just 5% of the world's population. In European countries, far-right parties are currently either in government, are part of governing coalitions, or have passed an electoral threshold, bringing them closer to becoming the new mainstream and putting the future of the EU in question. Already one of the EU's signature achievements, the free movement of countries and people across the 27 countries in the bloc, travel is no longer so free, as many countries have reconstituted their borders to stem the flow of inter-country migrants. Hungary, where Viktor Orban's electoral autocracy rules, aligns itself with Moscow, weakening EU cohesion and raising concerns among other EU countries about Hungary's role in fragmenting the EU itself. Several commentators believe we are entering an era of the strong men, intent on territorial expansion and dividing the world into their respective spheres of dominance. Thus, we have Vladimir Putin seizing parts of Ukraine, intent on defanging its sovereignty and re-establishing the pre-1991 status quo in Europe. Europe has extended its sphere of influence to North Africa, where it maintains a dominant presence in several of the Sahel countries. Xi Jinping is intent on seizing Taiwan and asserting sovereignty over the South China Sea and the islands off the coast of the Philippines and Japan. China's Belt and Road Initiative now involves over 150 countries, accounting for over 50% of global GDP. And the new strongman on the block, US President Donald Trump, is intent on seizing the Panama Canal and Greenland, and with his own brand of geopolitical madness, coercing Canada into becoming the 51st state. Appearing to side with Russia over the Ukraine, indeed calling Ukraine the aggressor, Trump has virtually cut ties with America's European allies of 80 years and cast doubt on the future of NATO. Cyber warfare, robotic warfare, supersonic intercontinental missiles that can carry nuclear warheads, and drones driven by AI have altered the character of war and blurred the lines between war and peace. Indeed, no matter where you look across the geopolitical spectrum, you find conflict, uncertainty, and anxiety about the future. The Ukraine-Russia war, now entering its fourth year, continues despite Trump's promise to end it in 24 hours. The rare earth minerals deal Trump is blackmailing Ukraine into accepting would rob the country of much of its sovereignty. Poland is seriously considering developing its own nuclear umbrella to shield it from possible Russian aggression. The Middle East is in turmoil. The Israel-Hamas war drags on with the resumption of massive aerial bombardment by Israel in the hope of forcing Hamas to release the 59 hostages still held in the Strip. But Israel, with the full backing of the US, is emerging as a hegemon in its own right, readying itself to fulfill Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's obsession, a preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear sites, dragging the US to its support. And just yesterday, the New York Times carried an article saying that Netanyahu was ready to make a strike, but was deterred by the United States for the moment. Indeed, the US itself has deployed a huge military force to its base in San Diego or Diego Garcia, an island in the Indian Ocean. B-2 bombers from the base carrying a payload of bunker-busting bombs can reach Iran. Trump has already put Iran on notice. If the talks between the US and Iran fail, Iran will pay a terrible price. Few ask what Iran might do in retaliation. A month ago, China conducted its biggest ever military exercise around Taiwan. And in the forgotten and neglected continent Africa, Sudan, Ethiopia, the Eastern Congo, Libya, and countries across North Africa are sated by conflict. Tens of millions of displaced people, 13 million in Sudan alone. Looking at the future, climate warming continues unabated. Global carbon emissions continue to rise, each year warmer than the last. The United States, the world's second largest emitter, withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement with a defined drill, baby, drill. The average global temperature increased by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius last year, exceeding the target set in 2015 in Paris as the temperature beyond which the world should not warm to avoid unforeseeable, unpredictable, and possible irreversible warming. Few countries are meeting their obligation to cut emissions by 50% by 2030, and no mechanisms are in place or agreed that would force them to do so. Instead, the great powers, the US, China, and Russia, are each staking their claims to parts of the Arctic. Ice-free sea paths will open sea routes across the North Pole between the Atlantic and Pacific. Trigger a race to assess mineral belts exposed by warming oceans, and hide nuclear submarines in the depth of the new waters. And finally, perhaps a new species, generative and sentient AI, artificial general intelligence with superhuman intelligence, even consciousness, which high-tech companies are in a mad race to achieve, with no guardrails in place to limit what they might be used for. And even some of the CEOs heading this bandwagon cheerfully admitting they have no ideas what their creations might be capable of. The doomsday clock was reset to 89 seconds in January, the closest to midnight since its inauguration in 1947. And on this less than cheerful note, I turn to John and Kumar. Which of you would like to lead off?
I don't mind if John is okay. Okay, all right. Thanks very much, Porrick. Thanks for the invitation, and very good to see Lord Allardyce as well. And to all those online greetings from Singapore. I perhaps I can contribute to our discussion this evening by maybe taking a couple of steps back to complement what Porrick has just mentioned. So for me, we need to, when we talk about the new world disorder, I mean, what do we mean, right? I mean, if we take a few steps back to the end of World War II in 1945, when the victorious allies, led by the US primarily, with the support of key allies like France and the UK, set up what basically became known as the Liberal International Order, or LIO, right? So the aim of the US-led LIO was to create a global system based on liberal democratic values, market capitalism, and multilateral trade and cooperation. So essentially, the US and its Western allies felt that there was a need to rein in the great power politics and shifting alliances that had led to two destructive world wars in the 20th century and replace this unstable interwar order with a more predictable post-war order governed by shared rules and norms. So such norms and rules and values were actually enshrined, as Porrick mentioned, in the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And this Declaration of Human Rights were in turn inspired by European Enlightenment principles and also the US Declaration of Independence. So more precisely, to recap, the Liberal International Order, or LIO, was ideologically grounded on liberal democracy, economic liberalism, and institutional internationalism, as well as shared values such as human rights, rule of law, freedom, and open markets. These ideas were proclaimed to be universally accepted and form the ideological basis of a rules-based international order, which is what the LIO was always supposed to be. And as Porrick mentioned, the LIO, the Liberal International Order, was institutionalized through various international organizations and agreements that emerged in the post-war era, such as, of course, the UN, the World Bank, IMF, GATT, General Agreements on Trade and Tariffs, which later, of course, evolved by 1994 into the World Trade Organization, WHO, amongst other organizations. So essentially, you know, many scholars have pointed out that the LIO had been remarkably successful since its inception after World War II in reducing international conflict and global poverty. The LIO has created vested interest in its maintenance, especially on the economic side. After all, you look at in recent times, the US-China trade war, the global economic tribulations as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, not to mention the current global concerns over Trump 2.0 administration's fluctuating tariff policies. Basically, they reinforce to all of us how so interconnected the global economy has become and why everyone wants to keep it from collapsing. So the LIO has been institutionalized in various, as I mentioned, international organizations and treaties. And even if down the decades, the LIO has been battered, these institutions have been a force for continuity, right? And the bottom line is the LIO has over the decades acquired a strong measure of international legitimacy, or what some scholars call rightfulness. Governments across a large swath of the world want to preserve it. That's why we are all worried about the rise of the current new world disorder, so to speak. That said, even during the peak, if you like, of the LIO's existence, right, end of World War II until now, there were essentially some concerns about its credibility as to whether or not it was achieving what it was supposed to be. I can mention three such challenges to the perception of the LIO that had been put out by its original architects. First, as American IR scholar John Mearsheimer pointed out, a true LIO, Liberal International Order, can only endure in unipolar systems where the leading state is a liberal democracy. That is, in a LIO, the dominant state is a liberal democracy, cooperating and trading with a substantial number of allied liberal democracies within a largely open world economic system. And this LIO is ideologically driven. It aims to spread democracy, creating a liberal democratic world order that is economically interdependent, and bound together by a set of common rules, as mentioned. However, as we all know, the post-war years are also the years of the Cold War between the US and the communist blocs. As Mearsheimer argues, the US and its allies built a strong international order during the Cold War, but it was actually neither international nor was it liberal. It was what Mearsheimer called a bounded order, whose principal purpose was to wage security competition with a rival bounded order dominated by the Soviet Union. So the US-led international order and the Soviet-led international order were on the surface liberal and communist respectively, but at their core, they were realist, right? After all, it was very well known that the US did not hesitate to prop up illiberal authoritarian governments during the Cold War in its nuclear standoff with the Soviets and the Chinese. For example, in Southeast Asia from 1956 to 1963, the US propped up the staunchly anti-communist Nor Diem regime in South Vietnam, although Diem was essentially an autocrat, right? So hence, during the Cold War, from the late 1940s until 1991, there were numerous accusations of double standards leveled at the core geopolitical architects of the LIO. Apart from doubts throughout the post-war decades as to how genuinely liberal the LIO was, a second significant shortcoming of the post-war LIO was that it was hierarchical, reflecting the dominant geopolitical and economic interests of the global North. So from the perspective of post-colonial states in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, the LIO, Liberal International Order, tended to systematically privilege the European core of the West and promoted a Eurocentric standard of civilization for the post-colonial global South to aspire to. So while the core LIO states in the West, at least on paper, privileged individual liberty, human rights, and democracy promotion over state sovereignty, the post-colonial states of the global South relied on sovereignty, that's a key, as a guarantor of freedom from external domination and control. Therefore, the post-colonial states of the global South have supported the LIO. It's not because of its liberal ideological orientation per se, but because of the LIO's promise to respect state sovereignty, as well as its economic benefits. Certainly by the decade of the 2000s, NATO expansion, the creation of the World Trade Organization, and a greater emphasis on human rights through, for example, the inauguration of the International Criminal Court in 2002, all closely aligned with Western liberal values. The spread of these norms and institutions enforcing them appeared to the global South as basically Western ideology dressed up as universal principles, point which I think Porrick also brought out. Hence, in response to mounting criticism, Western leaders by the 2000s began using the term rules-based international order instead of liberal international order. So whether we want to call it the LIO or the rules-based international order, this order aimed to emphasize procedural fairness, right? From the 2000s onwards, rules that all states in theory had agreed upon, rather than a system explicitly rooted in liberal ideological commitments. So the focus moved from promoting specific liberal norms to essentially maintaining stability and predictability. A third point that can be brought up about the post-war liberal international order is that following the end of the Cold War and the geopolitical and economic resurgence of great powers like China and Russia by the 2010s, which essentially thereby debunking earlier notions of what Fukuyama called the end of history, it became clear that China and Russia in particular did not accept the legitimacy of the LIO with the US at its core. China and Russia both strongly objected to the LIO concept. Beijing and Moscow argued that Western countries are trying to impose their unipolar model of the world order, where a small number of countries make the rules and the large majority has to abide by these rules. Beijing and Moscow emphasized that international rules must be agreed on by all and applied without double standards, as mentioned earlier. So if you look at China under President Xi Jinping since 2012, Beijing has been actively seeking to balance US power and maximize its own international influence through its own ambitious mega projects, such as, for example, Porrick mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, but also the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Civilizations Initiative, all the while seeking to exploit global South dissatisfaction with the US-led world order. Xi Jinping's concept of a community of shared future promotes not liberal democracy, but principles of sovereign equality, the democratization of international relations, common security, peaceful dispute resolution, and UN centrality. For its part, Russia aims to promote its global standing as a great power in a post-Western multipolar world, and as we have seen, has not been averse to using military force to do so. According to a recent paper by Chatham House in London, Russia seeks to maintain leadership and control over the post-Soviet states, which it regards as forming its sphere of influence. I'll come back to this idea shortly. Russia aims to secure its global standing as a great power through such a sphere of influence. Russia at the same time seeks to undermine Western political unity, eroding support in the West for transatlantic institutions and political communities. So this brings us to the current era of Trump 2.0. As I've tried to point out, even before the return of President Donald Trump to the White House, there had already been some questions about how the credibility of how the original Liberal International Order, LIO, had been presented by its original architects. To reiterate, by the 2000s, the decade of the 2000s, the LIO had evolved into a rules-based order that de-emphasized the liberal democratic ideological orientation. So for example, the Obama administration began using the term rules-based order. For that matter, so has Indian PM Modi, and even ASEAN countries prefer to use the term rules-based order, right, rather than liberal international order. Now, with the advent of Trump 2.0, some analysts have argued that we are seeing the end of the order, whether you call it LIO or RBIO, or rules-based international order. And in fact, as I fully agree, a very key comment made by the current Secretary, U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, January 2025, very significant. He declared that the post-war global order is not just obsolete, it is now a weapon being used against us, which suggests retrenchment from this idea of supporting the rules-based order. But if the liberal rules-based international order is obsolete, what's going to replace it? I think that's a $64,000 question. I mean, there's been a lot of analysis recently. Analysts like, for example, Yaroslav Trifomov and Seva Gunitsky have suggested that a Trump 2.0-led order, I mean, we call this in this seminar the New World Disorder, is possibly in the process of assuming the form of, for example, a post-liberal global order defined not by institutions or alliances, but by loyalty and hierarchy. Basically, such analysts are arguing that instead of a rules-based global order, the new global disorder, if you like, could be characterized by the return of geopolitical and geoeconomic spheres of influence or blocks, perhaps one led by the US in the Americas, one by China in the Far East, and one by Russia in Central and Eastern Europe at a minimum. This notion may not be that far-fetched, right? I mean, for example, where I come from in Southeast Asia, it has not been lost on observers in Southeast Asia that President Xi wasted little time in coming to Southeast Asia to boost ties following the Trump tariffs, right? He visited, President Xi just visited Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia to essentially push the message that China is a better partner than the US. For example, in Malaysia, President Xi and the Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim signed more than 30 deals to expand trade, investment, and collaboration on AI, for example. President Xi referred to the start of a new golden era in its relationship with Malaysia, and essentially the coming together of, this is significant, the coming together of an Asian family, right? And this contrast could not be more stark. Malaysia, like many other countries hit by the Trump 2.0 tariffs before the recent relaxation, the 90-day pause, Malaysia had also been trying to make an appointment with Washington to negotiate tariff reductions. Malaysia had been hit with a tariff rate of 24% before the 90-day pause, right? But currently, of course, it's 10%. President Xi's charm offensive at a time like this may be something worth paying attention to. As Seva Gunitsky, in a very perceptive article in the New Republic, recently argued, Trump's actions consistently reflect a great power-centric view of global order in which major states dictate terms while smaller states fall in line, their sovereignty conditional and tenuous. To preserve peace, powerful states, according to this paradigm, need zones of influence. So, for example, Russia might be argued to have legitimate claims over Ukraine in this paradigm, in the same way the United States might have claims in its own backyard. For example, one thinks about President Trump's recent assertions concerning Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal. In such a vision of a new world disorder, if you like, based on the essentially transactional style of Trump 2.0, Gunitsky identifies 5 operational principles that may become quite relevant. Number 1, the dominance of great powers. Number 2, the conditionality of alliances. Number 3, the weaponization of trade. Number 4, the irrelevance of institutions. And finally, the personalization of diplomacy. For small states around the world, like where I am from, Southeast Asia, such a kind of a order, right, where the international order is basically fragmented into separate power blocks or spheres of influence, each dominated by big states, what Gunitsky calls a multipolar tributary system, would indeed be concerning. Of course, we in Southeast Asia, or I would say East Asia, we hope that this will not be the case at all, and we can eventually return to the stability and the predictability of the rules-based order with its warts and all. The worrying bottom line is, as far as East Asia is concerned, is that the Trump 2.0 administration seems to be no longer keen on playing the US two traditional roles since the end of World War II. First, helping to ensure a functioning rules-based international order, and secondly, serving as the strategic guarantor for such an order. The new American isolationism has thus helped create what this seminar calls the current New World Disorder. That is, a world where the old rules promoting stability and predictability in interstate interactions have been undermined. It is a world that is, amongst other things, increasingly vulnerable to the predatory ambitions and expansionist designs of revisionist powers. In other words, what Thucydides in the history of the Peloponnesian War in the Million Dialogue said, the strong do what they can and the weak do what they must. So on that, a rather sober note, I'll pass the time back to Porrick and John. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumar. And John?
Thank you very much, Kumar, and thank you very much, Podrick. I'm going to try to pick up both the distressing and depressing reality that we face, and also later in what I say, perhaps some possibilities for how we might find another future. And then I'm sure in the Q&A, we'll be able to explore all sorts of aspects of this new climate in which we're living. For some years, actually, I've been warning publicly that we're heading into a third global conflict. And this at times led me to feel quite down about the prospects for humanity. Such a third global conflict would not simply be a rerun of the disasters of the 20th century, for before 1945, however terrible a war was and however many people died, the world would repair itself, and in time the population of the world could be restored. With the threat of nuclear war and the reality of climate change, humankind has brought about the very real danger of our own demise. However, when 2017 marked the 500th anniversary of the publication of Martin Luther's 95 Theses, which triggered the Protestant Reformation, I began to see some more positive parallels with our own times. In those days, 500 years ago, they had the disruptive technology of Gutenberg's printing press invented in the 1400s and spreading challenging ideas, especially when Luther, Wycliffe, and others translated the Bible into the vernacular languages. Everything had been in Latin before then in Europe, but now people could understand in their own language. We now have the disruptive technologies of social media spreading messages that impact our thinking. And the amplification of conflicting messages promotes widening splits that undermine community cohesion. Artificial intelligence is also automating the firing of weapons at speeds that make human thinking and intervention impossible, so-called hypersonic weapons. Inexpensive drones and precision weapons reduce the possibility of having any safe space, and computing can now mimic human thought so that you can't tell the difference. Disruptive technologies in our time, indeed. Half a millennium ago, there was also a widespread belief that those in authority, mostly princes and bishops in the West, were utterly corrupt and did not have the interests of the people at heart. In our own time, too, there's a profound loss of faith in authorities of all kinds, not just political and religious, but sporting and even scientists. The justifiable anger about widespread corruption, broken promises, financial disaster, deep unfairness, and the undeliverable prospectus of equality has fomented this disenchantment. And the rise is, and we see a rise again in extreme nationalism and populism. Opposition to the new scientific discoveries of people like Copernicus, Galileo, and later Newton, though many hundreds of years ago, made people realize that the leaders of the societies in their times did not understand what was going on. And it's clear that many of today's political leaders really do not comprehend the complex developments in science and technology or their implications, as was evident in the responses of some leaders to the pandemic. However, in our time, this has all resulted in a disenchantment with all expertise, including that of scientists. So these three developments, disruptive technology, deep anger about corruption and unfairness, and disdain for the quality of socio-political leadership, led some people to challenge the thinking of their times. And I began to wonder if something similar could be happening in our day. Our old forms of understanding and ordering society are dissolving, I think, for reasons that are not so very different from those faced by our predecessors half a millennium ago. However, one important difference was that at that time, they seemed to have a clearer idea of the alternatives: democracy instead of authoritarianism, the law guided by a moral code, education and science replacing obscurantist forms of religious authority. But if major paradigm shifts had been possible in their day, are there possibilities for us and our children now too? I began to think and speak a bit more positively, not because we could avoid the terrible chaos and destruction of global war. I believe that we've already gone too far for that. But I thought perhaps the crises over these three issues and others could force us to take the thinking of humanity forward, so long as we did not allow ourselves to be completely destroyed by nuclear or environmental holocausts. At this inflection point in human history, it remains an open question whether global leaders and their followers can put shallow, selfish, short-term political and economic interests aside in favor of global peace, stability, and reconciliation, or even the survival of our species. But the alternative is pretty terrible to contemplate. While we can always see the faults in others, we in Europe and the United States, as Padraig and Kumar have pointed out, have had a deeply flawed approach to foreign policy and conflict resolution that has contributed directly to the catastrophic dissolution into chaotic, violent conflict across the globe. And it has been getting worse. As they have pointed out, people everywhere are turning away from the ideals of rationality and liberal democracy. The liberals of the early 20th century also had to radically revise their understanding of society. Sigmund Freud, who declared himself a classic liberal, had to completely modify his psychoanalytical theories in the wake of the savagery of the First World War. And a century later, crisis and war are, I believe, forcing us to address unwelcome challenges to some of our key assumptions. As a young man, I trained in psychoanalysis because I found the rationalistic perspective of the political science of those days in the 1970s pretty unconvincing. It did not, for me, satisfactorily explain the violent and intractable political conflict in my own country. However, I could see that psychoanalysis took account of people acting against their own best socioeconomic and power interests. And as I explored it in my own small community and beyond, it became clear to me that rather than being won over by the offer of mere socioeconomic benefits, partisans, when they were living in situations of historic and existential conflict, were often even more resistant to compromise when offered material benefits, but they could be open to psychologically and symbolically significant offers. Revolutionaries and insurgents would often sacrifice everything for their cause and frequently be committed more strongly to their comrades than even to their families. And they often prevailed against overwhelming odds, especially when they were fighting professional armies that relied only on the material incentives of pay and promotion. I was very struck by the fact that the United States, for example, with the most powerful military machine in the history of mankind, rarely, if ever, seemed to win any major wars after the Second World War. So I asked myself not only why that was happening to the United States, the powerful one, but what is happening in the minds of those who are willing to put themselves in the line of fire for the sake of their cause. When experiencing existential threat, people may move from being rational actors to being devoted actors, driven by faith or commitment to defend or advance non-negotiable sacred values. I don't mean particularly religious values, they may well be secular values. But anyone who tries to weigh up the socioeconomic values of faith in God or loyalty to country or commitment to a political cause will be left somewhat bemused. For these kinds of values cannot be judged by socioeconomic metrics. This is one of the reasons why Mr. Trump will inevitably run into insuperable problems. Politics and business have quite different values. And people in existential threat situations will make sacrifices because they believe it is right, not because of a cost-benefit call. After centuries of recurring violence in Ireland, we moved away from a rational actor model that focused solely on the law and political and economic structures and engaged instead in the analysis of the interlocking sets of disturbed historic relationships between our communities of people. And there were three important ones. That between Protestant Unionists and Catholic nationalists within Northern Ireland. The second, between the people of Ireland North and South. And thirdly, between the peoples of Britain and Ireland. And we addressed these three sets of relationships in three matching strands of negotiations. And the outcome was three interlocking sets of institutions. But building the institutions did not come first. They were an outcome of the analysis and engagement in resolving relationship problems. Now, confirmation of the value of this analysis and approach of multiple sets of communal relations became clear not only in the success of bringing the violence to an end through the 1998 Belfast Good Friday Agreement, whose 30th anniversary is not far away, but also later in reverse, when the neglect of the institutions contributed to subsequent problems within Northern Ireland, but perhaps even more strikingly between the United Kingdom and Ireland after Brexit. These British-Irish problems were linked with the requirements of two other external sets of relationships with the European Union and with the United States, and the strains there are only too obvious. But in terms of Britain and Ireland and United Kingdom and Europe, the problems were resolved only when the British Prime Minister of the time, Rishi Sunak, and the EU President, Ursula von der Leyen, abandoned the transactional regulatory arguments that had resulted in the standoff and returned to developing a positive working relationship with each other. It wasn't all about rules and regulations. It wasn't even about simple economic benefit. It was about developing a positive working relationship. And this is an example of how developing a theory and practice based on the complexity of relationships of communities rather than on the linearity of rational transactional political theory could produce a positive outcome in a previously intractable conflict. Are there any indications of what kind of change in our thinking might bring us to the new paradigm that I've been talking about? Well, Today, interdisciplinary connections are key. We have to move beyond the old professional and academic silos. Physicists, for example, have found they can understand everything about hydrogen and everything about oxygen, but understanding those two elements does not tell them anything about what emergent properties to expect when hydrogen molecules are brought together as and oxygen molecules are brought together as water. And understanding a molecule of water does not tell you about what wetness is. In other words, breaking everything down into its fundamental parts does not help us to understand the problems of complexity. Those that followed birds, ornithologists, have recognized for a long time that when they're trying to understand a murmuration of starlings, there's no point in trying to say, oh, I wonder which one is the leader. There is no individual leading bird. It doesn't exist. The flocks of birds are not led by one or more leaders, nor are they merely a collection of individual birds. As has become apparent in my field of psychology, exploring how people function consciously and unconsciously requires a larger and wider appreciation of the impact of culture, politics, genetics, and past generational resilience and trauma. Molecules, birds, human beings all function not on their own, but as elements within systems. And some of them are complex adaptive systems. So breaking it down into fundamental elements and seeing everybody as simply individuals following their own needs isn't sufficient to help us understand what is happening or what we can do about it. That's why I've been suggesting that we need to move beyond the radical rationalism and individualism of some old-style Enlightenment thinking and embrace the emergence of complexity science, appreciating that our emotions are a part of how we think and are a positive evolutionary advantage, not a flaw, to be overcome in favor of a rational thought. And also to focus on the significance of relationships between individuals and communities rather than simply on the individuals themselves. So these three elements I'm suggesting may together point forward to a new path for survival and our next evolutionary way station. We can't be sure. Indeed, one of the key insights of complexity science is that the resilience of systems brings outcomes that are not predictable, not just because we don't know enough, but because they are fundamentally unpredictable, as Heisenberg pointed out many years ago. The challenge of moving to a new and different paradigm is significant. It's not easy. And there does remain a very real risk that we will just wipe ourselves out before we get there. However, if we can focus, I think, on fairness, on cooperation and community, and a radical new way of understanding based on complexity theories and the full breadth of human knowledge and science, might it bring peace, stability, and prosperity? If we expand our perspective beyond the rational individual actor and work to create caring and cooperative ways of being in community without losing our concern for the individual, and if we can be informed by our emotions as well as our rationality, if we can base our understanding on external reality and also appreciate the internal wishes, fears, and creativity we hold within ourselves. And if we can appreciate the lessons of world history and use them to understand the complexity of large group relations, might we rebuild our resilience as a human race and stem off the catastrophic destruction portended by a third global conflict? I think it's still possible, but we have to work at it with enormous commitment.
Thank you, John. And again, thank you, Kumar. I'll follow up with a couple of questions and then we'll open it to Q&A. And I want to tell anybody who is participating in the webinar that if you have a question, you're to type it into the question and answer box with your name, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. Well, I want to go take John for a moment take this whole issue of complexity and how, for there now have been 30 global meetings of countries on climate change. The initial hope or the aim being to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the fact is, there's this massive failure. We've now exceeded 1.5%. Countries are simply not meeting the goals to which they committed themselves. And this could be a real existential threat that we do not know what will happen to the planet if you reach a point, a number of tipping points, where climate change becomes irreversible no matter what we do about emissions. So why has these global meetings, which are attended to by 100,000 people, why have they failed to achieve basic goals? One. And two, why is there the lack of any kind of consensus that this is an existential threat? And three, how would you apply complexity science or complexity theory to address the various elements of climate, the absence of consensus on climate?
Well, let me go back to what I was saying earlier on. Part of the problem is when you take that kind of approach, here's a problem, it's this practical problem, and we've got to resolve it, and can we have a series of propositions as to how to resolve it, but without having any working relationship between the players, it doesn't work. So, for example, as you very well know, and you've written lots about it, in Ireland, people got together, both Britain and Ireland, and they were given the agenda: stop the violence, produce workable institutions, which is the kind of equivalent of what you're saying: stop the temperature increase in the world and find ways of containing and controlling that. And although that seems terribly sensible and rational, it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because there's no relationship between the players. They don't feel any loyalty to each other. They don't feel any kind of shared responsibility. And so when, for example, in the later time, once we got into the so-called Good Friday process, we didn't start into, well, what are your proposals? And what are your proposals? And what are the what we started to say was, wait a minute, let's try to understand the relationships between us. Let's try to listen to the other guy. What do they see as being the problem? What do they see as being the important challenges that have to be dealt with? What do they see as being the difficulties? And of course, if you start to listen, if, for example, Europe and the United States were to start to listen to how China, India, Russia, the global South think about things, what they would say is, wait a minute, you guys have been running the show in your own interests. You pointed this out quite rightly. You've been running the show in your own interests. It hasn't really, you've been pretending that it's in all our interests, but it's not. It's in your interests. And that's the way you've been doing it. Well, that's not going to work. We're not going to accept that anymore. We may even bring the whole house down, but we're not going to accept it anymore. What's necessary is to say, well, wait a minute, we actually appreciate that you're right. And therefore, we're going to have to try to find a way of making a better relationship with each other and understand the problems that each sees, and then find a way of engaging with that. And both you and Kumar pointed out that to a very great extent, the whole world system was modeled after the Second World War around a way of thinking and engaging that was based on Western liberal democratic principles, Enlightenment principles, and on what was in the best interests of those states that represented them. And the truth is that there are, and also, by the way, saying that those principles were universal. So, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which came out of the European Enlightenment, those are universal principles. And whenever people, for example, the leader of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, started to say, well, wait a minute, we don't actually entirely share those views. There are Asian rights and principles that we have a different way of viewing. He was dismissed. Now, he didn't take that too seriously. He just got on with making a successful country. But there were many people in the liberal West who said, no, you can't. These are universal principles, with no recognition that they're not universal, that there are cultures that see things fundamentally differently, that don't look to the individual, but look to the community, for example. So what's important is that we begin to sit down and listen to what the other guy says, the other girl says, about their culture, their way of thinking about things. And this is going to take quite some time. It's not going to be done overnight. And it's not going to solve the problems overnight either. But it seems to me that the only way I have found that we can engage in a better way forward is by focusing on the relationships between the communities and then working together, accepting a degree of pluralism that has not been the case in the West at all. And then we have the chance of an outcome. And you might well say to me, but we don't have time for that, John. The temperature's going up. We're in terrible danger. And you would be right. There are these problems. But, you know, I used to find exactly that being said by patients when they would come and see me. They would say, well, how long is it going to take to resolve this problem? And I would say, well, I don't know. How long did it take you to get into it? They say, 25 years. They say, well, it might take that length of time to get out of it again. Oh, but we can't do that. And I would say to them, you know something? We can't start yesterday. The soonest that we can start a new way of doing things is today. And if we don't start today, it'll have to be tomorrow. So the best thing to do is accept that we can't magic it away, and we have to start in a different way than we did before. So it's a completely different way of thinking and working and approaching things based on relationships, not on jockeying for position or on working out the end game at the start.
Kumar, could you chip in here? You talked about a possible new order based on spheres of influence, a dominant player, and smaller countries like tributaries of the dominant player. So I want to take that and ask again on climate change: is democracy capable of resolving the problems of climate change?
Well, I mean, thanks for the question, Warwick. Actually, this is a very, very pertinent question. In fact, as I was listening to John, I was also like trying to think about why have we not moved on climate change at a faster pace, given that, you know, the science is very clear that we really need to be doing something. And it's a very, very important question. I think my perspective is complements what John has said. I mean, if you look at history, and I got a historian by background, I mean, if you look at, for example, in the Southeast Asia, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, when it was first founded in 1967, between 1967 and 1975, it was essentially functioning more like a cultural association, right? The diplomatic and political urgency wasn't really there. But after the fall of Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City now, in April 1975, and when the threat of communism in Southeast Asia became very real to the rest of the ASEAN countries, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, that's when you really saw a burst of political energy, of diplomatic energy, in ensuring that ASEAN became more cohesive. So what I'm getting at is, I think it's human nature, even for large groups, that, in my view, that you do need to have a common perception of a significant existential threat before you see demobilization. Perhaps a more contemporary example would have been the response of NATO after the Russian invasion in Ukraine. NATO was seen to be like chugging along just fine, but the levels of defense spending as a percentage of GDP, they were supposed to hit 2%, but not really. But after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, you also saw a similar burst of political energy, diplomatic energy, urgency that, NATO countries began looking at the defense budgets again. So, and that's because of a shared perception of the emergence of a very serious threat on the horizon. If you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, I would argue that once the pandemic, WHO declared that as a global health emergency, there was a similar burst of collective collaboration in the scientific community as well as governments, and which, among other things, resulted in the very relatively fast development of mRNA vaccines. So to me, why haven't we seen this kind of urgency in the climate crisis? To me, it's because of the nature of the crisis. It is something which is not at the doorstep, is not perceived to be seen as at our doorstep, collective doorstep. It's seen to be down the road. It's very hard to visualize and conceptualize it in ways which the general publics around the world can sort of grasp. I mean, the scientists get it, right? But the challenge to me is how to spread this scientific knowledge and make it digestible for the wider international community, among all the publics in the world, so that people see that, we really need to be doing something urgent about this. So I think that's the big challenge in my perception. Thanks.
Okay, I've got just two quick questions, and then I'll go to questions in the box. One is on Ukraine. Is it realistic to expect some kind of peace agreement emerging here, or will there be an armistice? And like the war will stop with undefined borders, and it'll be like North and South Korea. And that's one. And two, and you both are involved, in John in particular, on monitoring relations between the United States and China, and in a group trying to identify what the red lines may be and what can be done to avert those red lines being crossed. And are we getting closer to those red lines being crossed? Okay, that's for both of you, and then we'll go to the box.
John, want me to go first? I can go first.
Okay, well, let me pick up on Ukraine first of all.
Sure.
We have to face the reality we don't know what the outcome is going to be. And that's one of the things we learn from complexity science. You don't know the future. And if you go back to the Second World War and look at how things were at a whole series of stages there, you could well at a number of points said, well, it's clear Hitler's going to win. And people have even written counterfactual documents about what would have happened if he had won. What would have happened if he hadn't tried to invade Russia, for example, and concentrate in Western Europe. I mean, if you look at some of the stages where, and let's not forget, the United States didn't come into the Second World War, or indeed the First World War, until late on. So it's quite difficult to put yourself back into those situations in the past and recognize what it must have seemed like and what it must have appeared to be at an earlier stage. We look back now knowing what the outcome was. It's like knowing the outcome of a film or a book. It's a completely different experience than if you don't know the outcome, and then you have to just think about it and experience all the anxiety and so on and so on. So we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know whether in Ukraine. One of the things I would say is that as far as it's concerned, I have seen changes of emotions on both sides. And I keep quite substantial conversations going with people on the Russian side who have a close connection with the Kremlin. And I have seen changes in their mood. At times I got the sense that they weren't really very sure how it was going to be, and that other times, particularly recently, it has seemed to me that after the recent interventions by Donald Trump, they're feeling very confident, and they're not feeling like any kind of negotiated outcome at all. In fact, on the contrary, they're actually putting more obstacles in the way and saying, oh, well, you'll have to do this and this and this as well. So we don't know, because you can't predict what Donald Trump is going to do or how other people are going to react. So I just think we don't know. And one of the things that has not really come into the conversation very much until now is the role of Europe. You know, it's all the great powers being Russia, China, and the United States. In terms of economy, in terms of the military potential, if it came together, Europe is extremely significant and powerful in terms of technology too. But it's kind of been dismissed, not least because, of course, the United States was extremely keen to see Europe not having armaments and not being united and together. And indeed, it was made very clear that was the case over quite a period of time. That's all changing. It all changed with the invasion of Ukraine. Suddenly, Poland, Germany, Britain, France, Italy began to say, hey, wait a minute. And that's not even to mention Scandinavia and the Baltic states. We can't depend on the United States to defend us. And of course, that mood has only developed and become stronger and stronger. Therefore, a dramatic change is going to take place. Germany is now rearming and putting huge amounts of money towards that in a way that would have frightened people in Britain or France or the United States 20 or 30 years ago. They would say, oh my goodness, is a monster coming back? Instead, people are saying, well, no, you have to do that. So there's a big change taking place. I think we just don't know is the uncomfortable answer. And there are various different ways that it could go. I don't think that you can make any assumptions on the basis of the past. That's not a very comfortable answer, Porrick, because you obviously, if you ask a question like that, you're wanting an answer that says, well, it'll be this or it'll be this. I think we're in a new world. Looking back at the old models does not tell us how it's going to be in the future. And the idea that we can predict it is simply not going to be the case. And, you know, in terms of these great powers and the great power rivalry that Kumar kind of focused on and so on, that is not going to lead to peace. I mean, just look at what happened when Joe Biden went to Lima. He discovered that the Chinese had built an absolutely enormous mega port there. And the kinds of things he was offering were peanuts in comparison. That's Peru. That's in the United States backyard. You know, whenever you're talking about spheres of influence, Latin America would have been part of the United States sphere of influence. China is based there now in a huge way. And not just in Lima in Peru, but in lots of other Latin American countries as well. And indeed in the Caribbean. One country I know very well indeed is Barbados. And the Chinese have been investing huge amounts of money there in various ways. So the idea that it's going to be easily divided up into a sort of Yalta 2.0, where the three great powers of the United States, Russia and China this time round, rather than Britain, the United States and Russia, that they'll divvy it up and that will create stability. It's not going to create stability at all. And as I say, it doesn't even pay attention to the size and significance of the Europe. And I don't mean the EU, I mean Europe, which has a wholly different perspective on what's going on with China. They feel much less antagonistic to China than is the case in the United States, and much more concerned about Russia than is the case with the United States. And also that set of relationships is not just bounded to the European continent. It's quite clear that the relationship with Canada in North America is beginning to develop in a very significant way. And if Mark Carney is elected at the end of this month as Prime Minister of Canada, you're going to see a different kind of Canada than you've ever seen before. And nobody could have believed 6 weeks ago that the Liberals had any chance of winning the election, given what I saw. The idea that you can predict these things, I wish it were so, but it's not. And the world is a different place from it was before for a whole bunch of reasons.
Sure.
Yes, thanks.
Trent.
Just a quick one on Ukraine. I believe the previous US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was told by a Russian official that as far as the Russians are concerned, Ukraine means a lot more to them than to the US. So, I mean, using some of the concepts which John has mentioned, I wonder, you know, I wonder when I read that, you know, whether or not to the Russian side, particularly to President Putin, Ukraine is something like a sacred value for him.
Mhm.
I mean, if you look at his actions,
Absolutely.
I mean, you know, he sort of like ensured that he intervened in Russian academia to sort of like reinterpret history to sort of portray, you know, how integral Ukraine has been to Russia's own history, how Ukraine is very much part of the cradle of Russian civilization, you know. So on the balance of relative commitment, you know, what I have to ask, you know, I mean, before the current US administration, you could, I mean, perhaps you could say that you could argue that the previous American administration was very committed to Ukraine's defense. Of course, the Ukrainians under President Zelensky, they are very committed. It's a sacred value to them. Their freedom is a sacred value. But now with the, I'm going back to that rather surreal shouting match in the White House between President Trump, President Zelensky, right, which everybody remembers. To me, one big takeaway I had from that was that you know, looks like, you know, the balance of commitment or in terms of the devotion to sacred values is decisively seems to be on the Russian side. So how this turns out, you know, I hope it doesn't, you know, but it could be that this conflict would be settled, to me as an analyst, on Russian terms at the rate things are going, but hopefully I'm wrong. Thanks.
I think you're absolutely right about the sacred values business, Kumar. And it's not just a political quote sacred value, it's a religious sacred value. You know, who would have thought 30 or 40 years ago that the centerpiece of the Soviet Union would revert to an absolute commitment to Russian Orthodox religion. I mean, it just shows you how things can dramatically change. But that's why I say it's not a question of whether or not the United States can negotiate a peace settlement with Russia. It's not all about the United States. It's about Europe. And that's the point that I want to make. People in the United States and people who have looked to the United States as the global hegemon, I think need to come to understand it isn't the hegemon anymore. It's over. And you know, go back and read Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That's what we're seeing, only at double quick time in the United States. We've got a Nero who's fiddling while Rome burns in Washington. It's a dramatic change. Nothing like it has been seen in our lifetime, not even the fall of the Berlin Wall.
In China, is the China-US confrontation inevitable?
I think a confrontation is inevitable, but is a war inevitable? No. I don't think a war is inevitable. But there will be conflict, there will be discomfort, there will be great difficulties. I've no doubt about that at all. And Kumar's absolutely right to point to the so-called Thucydides trap of how a hegemon regards the up-and-coming replacement hegemon. And that's exactly what's happening. And that's in a sense why the United States is ignoring Europe. But it's not going to be so simple as that, because it's not just about the United States and Europe. For example, what's going to happen when Europe itself intervenes and says, well, actually, we don't agree with China on a whole bunch of stuff, but we are prepared to trade with them, and we are prepared to take their electric vehicles, and we are prepared to do a whole bunch of things that America may not want. It's a much more complex business than it was. So is there going to be a conflict? Absolutely. Will there be a confrontation? I've no doubt about it. Will it issue in a violent war? That I think we cannot be certain of, thankfully.
I would agree with John. Given the kind of military maneuvers you see in the Taiwan Strait, there is a chance, significant chance of a miscalculation and inadvertent collision, for example, which could spiral out of control. But I mean, that's a possibility, but I don't think there is a desire on the part of any of the major players, whether it's the Taiwanese or the Chinese or the US, to sort of like actually deliberately precipitate a conflict. I don't think that's what they would want, but an accidental miscalculation, Taiwan Straits is something that is, to me, possible. I mean, it is very interesting that Sir Robin Niblett, in his excellent book, The New Cold War, talks about how the Taiwan Strait is essentially the key flashpoint of the new Cold War, essentially between the US and the Chinese. And certainly that one has to watch what is going on there. That will be a very important theater to pay attention to. I'll stop there.
Could I pick up on that? Because I mean, I think you're right, Kumar, and I completely agree with you. But I want to reflect back to what I said earlier about people and communities having very different cultures and ways of thinking about things. And we start talking about a Cold War between the United States and China. China has not, in my lifetime, started wars. It doesn't do it. It's been able to build its prosperity and take that prosperity and invest it in all sorts of ways and in all sorts of places. Meanwhile, the United States, which claims to be, living under the rule of law and all of these kinds of things, is constantly starting wars all over the place. Anybody that doesn't agree with them, and we have a president who's threatening anybody that doesn't agree in his country as well as out of his country that it'll be the worst for them, and so on and so on and so on. What's the result of that? The result of that is that the United States has impoverished itself. It has spent absolutely humongous amounts of money conducting destructive wars where all sorts of things get wrecked and destroyed. Virtually nothing gets created out of it. So whenever you think about some kind of confrontation between China and the United States, you're not talking about two protagonists who take the same perspective about conflict. China takes a very different view than the United States, and the United States judges China on the basis of the way it thinks about things rather than the way the Chinese think about things, which is very culturally different.
It struck me that after Trump imposed his tariffs on China and they responded to tariffs of their own, that the Trump administration seemed not to know that China had emerged from a century of humiliation, and that it simply, this humiliation they would not take, and it united the Chinese people. It gave them kind of cohesion, whereas in the United States, the imposition of tariffs had the opposite effect. People saying, oh, prices are going up, how can I afford this, how can I afford that, this is awful. It divided people rather than bringing them together.
Absolutely right.
Okay, we have time for one or two quick questions. And one is, why are human rights and human values becoming so irrelevant these days? Why are human rights in such trouble?
John, you want to have a go at that one?
I think the first thing is that the notion of human rights as the rights of individual people is something that is strongly held by countries in Europe and with the United States, Canada, and so on, in what they say about themselves. But they haven't been that good about recognizing the individual rights of many people in other parts of the world, notably in the global south. Secondly, when it comes to the question of rights, there are many countries that say, well, the individual is important, but actually the community is even more important. We don't share this so-called Enlightenment view that it's all about the individual, it's all about rationality. We actually think that it's extremely important that the community is maintained and sustained and so on. And sometimes individuals will find themselves suffering for it. Actually, in truth, we all accept that. When we ask people, soldiers, to go to war, we are asking them to sacrifice themselves for the well-being of the community. So the truth is that the notion that we have portrayed of individual human rights trumping, if that's not an unfortunate term, trumping everything else, the truth is much more complex than that. And I think our refusal to understand that complexity has led many people to dismiss the idea of human rights. And it shouldn't be dismissed. It should be expanded. We need to understand there are not just individual human rights, but the groups also have rights, communities have rights, and they need to be taken into account as well. And that's not something that the West has been very good at, and it's undermined the important principle of human rights. And as the questioner was saying, it has less currency now than it did a decade ago.
And if I may add to that, Warwick, what John said, his earlier comment about how one has to look at the political historical context and different geographical places. I mean that has to be taken into context as well. For example, I mean in Singapore, historically speaking, the first generation of political leaders, I mean they did pay a lot of attention to individual freedoms but at that time there was a major communist insurgency in both Malaya and Singapore, and the communists, of course, didn't really care about human rights. They wanted to impose their kind of political regime through the use of violence, and so that's why, at least in the case of Singapore in the 1960s, the government at that time emphasized order, framework of law and order, because the argument at that time was that if you don't have a strong framework of law and order, you will not be able to exercise any kind of human rights, because you're under threat. So that's the context matters. I mean the whole issue of whether or not the human rights are universal, I mean that's not a new issue. It's not a new debate. It remains ongoing. But if you look at the international system, maybe at this point in time, yes, the human rights issue doesn't seem to be that taken as seriously as it should be. But who knows? Perhaps back in time it may come back. But it's hard to say. Right now, it doesn't seem to be the case, unfortunately. Yeah.
So finally, I'll get you in on time. Looking at the future, what do you see? Are we in for a period of the next 4 years where the Trump administration's foreign policy is essentially America first, and everything else falls into line? Or can you see beyond that to, is there any kind of emergent consensus about our critical challenges of the future? Or are we in for a long period of instability, uncertainty, and anxiety about the future?
Kumar, do you want to pick up on that
Sure.
first of all?
Yep. Thank you. Sorry to say that at this point in time, I myself am somewhat a little pessimistic. I think that, I think we will be very lucky if we don't eventually go down the route, as some analysts are warning that the international order may sort of decompose and fragment into spheres of influence dominated by big states. As some analysts have been saying, the US in the Western Hemisphere, Russia in Europe, and China in the Far East, where essentially the rule of law is less important than what some analysts call a multipolar tributary system. I mean, some indications we see indicate that we may be entering such an era. I hope not. I do believe that there are still elites out there, in political economic elites, that have a significant role to play. in terms of bringing some reason back into the debate and the discourse. I mean, for example, the recent Trump tariffs, Trump pulled back from the imposition of these crippling tariffs and the 90-day pause because business leaders lobbied their Republican congressional representatives to tell the president that, you know, this is going to lead to political and economic ruin. So reason does exist in the system. But the question is whether or not the communities of reason can coalesce around the world in key countries in a way that will generate enough political momentum to stem the drift towards that kind of worst case scenario where the world is fragmented into blocks. I'm not that optimistic at this point in time, but hopefully, you know, we can see some progress. Perhaps, you know, to me, America is the center of gravity. The American public is the center of gravity. Midterm elections are coming next year. If the American public can rise to the occasion as they have done in the past, perhaps they can sort of inject reason back into their process and compel their policymakers to sort of take the more responsible route as far as international interactions are concerned and restore respect for the rules-based order. Yeah, thank you.
Wrap it up.
I share Kumar's anxiety and concern, but I think we may or may not survive. We can't know. I'm not necessarily sure that rationality is what's going to get us out of the hole. I think there are realities which will simply come to bear. And for example, you now have a Canadian Prime Minister who has actually made an enormous impact because he understands international economics. And he started to pull the plug on a lot of this nonsense from Trump by affecting the international bond markets. He went to the Japanese, he went to the Europeans, he had significant influence himself through bond holding in Canada. And suddenly it began to become clear that the old rules no longer applied. People weren't going to turn to the dollar. They weren't going to turn to American bonds. And that reality, even if he doesn't recognize it, it just will make a change. And I actually believe that we're not going to find a restoring of American hegemony. I think it's over. I think that's finished. It's not going to come back. There's going to be a lot of thrashing around the place. The Americans, you know, it'll be like watching a cowboy die in a shootout. You know, it won't be sudden. They'll stagger about and so on. But the reality is, it's gone, and it's not going to come back. And as I say, I don't think it's all about America, and I don't think it's all about American populations. I think there's a huge other population of people out there who now have power, who have views, who have perspectives, and they're going to have an impact, and it's going to be a very different world. I don't think it'll be those three powers on their own. I don't think India is going to accept being run by China. I don't think Europe is going to accept being run by Russia or divvied up between Russia and the United States. I don't think Latin America, I don't think China is going to be content to allow Latin America to be dominated by the United States. I think it's all much more complex. That could lead to catastrophic wars, or it could lead to simply a new kind of system that's different from anything that we've seen before. I think we have to hope for the latter, even if we fear that the former may actually be what happens.
Okay, thank you both. I've really enjoyed this, and it was great listening to your insights. And we have a recording which you will get in due course.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Porrick. It's been fun talking with you and Kumar, as it always is.
Yeah, and Kumar, you go to bed now.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the debate as well.
All the very best.
Good night.
Yes.
Bye.
Good afternoon.